I'm going to get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our February Lunch and Learn, which is titled The Impact of Colonial Rule in Rwanda. And it's one that I am going to lead. So welcome. You're here with me for the afternoon, late morning, early afternoon. My name is Sarah Brown, and I am the Executive Director of the Center for Holocaust, Human Rights, and Genocide Education, or Chhange with 2 H's. And before I continue, I want to note that our center is housed on the occupied territory of the Lenape people. For those of you who are new to Chhange, welcome. Our center has worked for the past, now we're in our 42nd year, so the past 42 years to promote the elimination of anti-Semitism, racism, and all forms of prejudice through innovative education about the Holocaust, other instances of genocide, and human rights. And since going virtual in late March, I can't believe it, almost a year ago, our center has provided now more than 45 programs that have reached over 40,000 people across 6 continents. Please visit our website, www.chhange.org, it's Chhange with 2 H's, to learn more about our available resources to support virtual learning and teaching, view the programs that we have scheduled for the rest of the spring, including a number of programs that are coming up this April, and also to schedule a tour of our virtual exhibit, virtual tour of our exhibit, Journeys Beyond Genocide, the Human Experience. Chhange programming occurs because of the generosity of members and program participants like you. So thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for supporting us, especially during this unprecedented and difficult year. Please continue joining Chhange as a member if you're not already a member, or contributing to support this and future programming. And after this session, you will receive an email of additional resources, as well as a link to be able to watch this program on our YouTube page. So a couple of quick housekeeping items regarding today's program. Your audio will remain muted throughout the program, but the chat feature is enabled. So please feel free to communicate with one another. Say hi, tell us where you're from. And if you have any questions along the way, type them into the chat box and we'll get to them later. And then at the end of my presentation, please feel free to add any questions you may have, conversation starters that you want to have, and we'll get to as many as possible. Funny enough, I'll be moderating my own Q&A, and so I'll try to get to as many as possible, and I'll answer whatever remaining ones that we don't get to during the program afterwards. And before we begin, I just want to quickly thank Chhange staff Allie Evans and also Susan Yellen and our new intern Caleb. Welcome, Caleb, for helping with today's program. And with that, I'm not going to do any big introduction for myself. Let's just get started. Okay. So the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda was rooted in historical events and processes that existed within, but also beyond the borders of the country. When we try to understand why the genocide in Rwanda occurred, there is no single answer. We can't point to one thing and say, yes, that's why it happened. There's no single answer that adequately explains the horror and the destruction that took place there. Many processes converged during that 100-day period that we now know as the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda. And today we're only examining one component of that, the role of colonialism and the legacy of colonialism that extended decades beyond colonial rule all the way up until 1994. So in this talk, I'm going to briefly cover some key elements of Rwanda's history, including details about Rwanda during the pre-colonial and the colonial times, and how this legacy of colonialism directly and indirectly contributed to the 1994 genocide. Here's the thing, and this is something that I'm always surprised when people are surprised to hear this, but here's the thing. Prior to colonial rule, there was an established Rwandan kingdom that existed. And its boundaries actually roughly trace the current map of Rwanda. This kingdom was highly organized, it traded throughout the region, and it included a shared culture, language, and leadership. It was there well before colonialism, and of course remains well after colonialism. Now, colonial rule began unbeknownst to Rwandans. They had no idea about the infamous Berlin Conference of 1884 and 1885. When European powers carved up the African continent like a cake that was free for the taking. They had no idea that this was even taking place. They had no idea that Germany and Belgium had come into an agreement about controlling that region. And it was several more years before German explorers and administrators even made contact. Still, colonialism arrived in Rwanda, and quite frankly, it wreaked havoc. It wreaked havoc until Rwanda became an independent country in 1962 and beyond. And by then, colonialism had radically changed the systems of power and influence that existed throughout the country, thus ensuring its destructive legacy continued well after they were gone. And I have to also note that they did this side by side along with Christian evangelism, which arrived around the exact same time. And it isn't the focus of today's talk, but it will come up a few times as evangelism and the white fathers who came, their efforts went hand in hand with colonialism, and they often served to justify colonial supremacy over Africans in Rwanda and beyond Rwanda. But today we'll focus really on the lasting impact of colonialism. Here, I want to note that when we trace the history of Rwanda, we risk what historian Jean-Pierre Chrétien refers to as the double trap. There's this double trap of liberal and radical history, as he explains them. So on the one hand, we have a liberal history of Rwanda, which might inaccurately over-idealize pre-colonial Rwanda and describe it as a paradise. It might pretend that the Mwami, or king, as he would be referred to now, that Mwami Rwabugiri's pre-colonial rule was filled with peace and stability. It might overlook that Rwabugiri, he had this very aggressive military expansion campaign that dominated the decades of his rule. He also went on a murderous purge of his own family members, and there was tremendous instability and violence that occurred after his death. Now, on the other hand, a radical history of Rwanda would pretend that Rwandan history only began with the arrival of white colonizers. Such a version would mark the start of Rwanda's history with the arrival of Richard Kant, maybe in 1898, and it would ignore the rich history that preceded colonialism. Neither version is accurate, and so today we're going to do our best to avoid those pitfalls and chart our own course. So, moving in chronological order, let's start with what did Rwanda look like before colonialism? Most historians agree that by the 15th century, Rwanda was organized into small semi-autonomous states. But when exactly the Kingdom of Rwanda, as it was found when the colonial administrators arrived and explorers arrived, when that it was founded, it is still subject to debate. But what we do know is that by the 18th century, a monarchical state had developed in Rwanda, and it had resulted in the creation and recognition of three distinct categories: Hutu, Tutsi, and Twa. Rwanda's monarchy was Tutsi-led, and the royal family was comprised almost exclusively of Tutsis. Still, at the same time, some of the court rituals were carried out by Hutus, and a number of Hutus served as chiefs and sub-chiefs throughout the kingdom. Thus, it was during this pre-colonial period that the off-cited identities of Tutsi and Hutu took shape, both as political and cultural and socioeconomic terms. But they were not the rigid ethnic categories that we saw in 1994. Instead, they were associated with power, who was the patron, who was the client, wealth. Those were the ways that you distinguish between Tutsi and Hutu. And throughout this period, there's also a degree of identity fluidity that exists. So if a Hutu acquired enough wealth and power, they could transition into the Tutsi category. And alternatively, if a Tutsi lost their wealth, or lost their status, they could transition to becoming a Hutu. Rwanda's pre-colonial period was also patriarchal, meaning that it was controlled by men. The Mwami, or king, also had this almost demigod-like status. And this power and the kingship passes from father to son. Now, that said, I do want to make the case that women did exercise some power during this period. For example, there was the queen mother, or the mother of the Mwami. she held significant clout and influence, often over the Mwami and over others, and her power, her influence, even though it was because she was the mother of the king, it also existed independent of the king. Now in 1860, Mwami Rwabugiri ascended to the throne, and he rules for 35 years. And under his sovereignty, the kingdom grows. It grows in size, and it also becomes increasingly centralized in its power, despite all of these internal skirmishes that occurred within the royal court. And this includes the fact that the Mwami at one point decided to murder off members of his family as part of a lineage purge. And there were also continuous military campaigns that expanded the geographic size of the kingdom considerably. This was a real big period of transition internally and externally within Rwanda and its borders. Now, the royal court during this time was rife with intrigue, and individuals and clans vied for influence and power. And there was this whole culture of subversion and conspiracy that contributed a bit to instability within the royal court and the kingdom. And so it's no surprise in a way that when Rwabugiri dies after 35 years of rule, two of his sons end up competing for the kingship, and they further destabilized the kingdom. Here we see that the role of the Queen Mother ended up proving quite vital. So the heir to the throne was a young man named Rutarindwa, and he had been designated by his father, Rwabugiri, to take over when Rwabugiri died. The problem is that Rutarindwa was being raised by an adopted mother because Rwabugiri had had his mother killed as part of one of those lineage purges. So he's being raised by an adopted mother known as Chhange. And Chhange turns on her adopted son and instead favors the ascent of her son by birth, Musinga. She wants him to become the king. Now, remember, the Queen Mother is this powerful person in and of her own right. And here, Chhange, through her adopted son and her birth son, was arguably the most powerful person in Rwanda. Chhange kept a tight rein over her own son and turned to clan purges, political assassinations, and ruthless violence to gain control of the kingdom. And this period of violence and instability really proves the monarchy's undoing because it syncs almost exactly in terms of chronology with the time when the German administrators are trying to gain influence in Rwanda and colonize Rwanda. So by the 1890s, we see that instability and violence have greatly weakened the kingdom, and they've created a power vacuum. And into that space enters Richard Kant, a German explorer, and the White Fathers, Catholic priests who also sought to influence the kingdom. They capitalized upon this conflict and exacerbated the continuing power struggle for kingship, often manipulating one party against the other to vie for power. This is how they established themselves as colonial rulers. Now, there's a bit more to it. There was an invasion of rogue Belgian forces out of the Congo that ended only after the German administrators got involved and invoked a pact that existed between Germany and Belgium. Again, this is one of those things that Rwanda didn't necessarily know about. This had all been agreed upon a decade earlier and on a whole other continent. But in the end, all of this serves the interests of Chhange's son by birth, Musinga. He ascends to the throne, and Chhange's adopted son, Rutarindwa, is out. So now we have King Musinga, Mwami Musinga. Now, what's interesting is that as Mwami, and by the way, he's photographed here, he's an adult here. So this photograph was taken in the 1910s, thereabout. And here you can actually see a photograph of him along with members of the royal family in traditional garb outside of a traditional Rwandan home. Now, as king, as Mwami, Musinga embraced the German protectorate so quickly that actually there is an argument amongst some historians who question if he really understood what he was doing when he accepted the German flag and German aid. At the same time, the court was divided over the influence of German rule, and also this policy of accommodation, which was eventually instituted by Conjugera's main advisor. Remember, the Queen Mother is still heavily influential at this time, and her son is quite young, so she's capitalizing on that to insert herself and exert her influence. But there's all this intrigue within the court, those that disagree with this policy, those that are for it, and these differences came to a violent head in 1905. And power coups had occurred in the past, but this time around, the German administrators are so powerful that they are able to intervene and stop the usual wave of killings that unrolled after the power coup. And so Richard Kant, the German resident of Rwanda, he was the figure that was really key to his country's success in Rwanda. He was appointed to this post officially in 1908, and he set about instituting a number of changes that still influence Rwanda. For example, he named Kigali the capital of the country. Kigali was not the capital of the country before this. This was not the power center. The power center was in the south where the king resided, the Mwami. He made Kigali the capital, and so it remained, and so it remains today. He also deftly manipulated conflicts that existed between the Rwandan monarchy and the White Fathers, further ensuring and expanding German influence. He would often be, Kant would be brought in to adjudicate whenever there was a dispute between the White Fathers and the monarchy, and as a result, he was able to keep gaining more and more influence. Meanwhile, the tensions that existed between the royal court and the White Fathers eventually did come to a head. And so after the Belgians formally replaced the Germans as the colonial authority in 1922, this follows after World War I, where Germany is stripped of their colonies as punishment for their role in World War I. Belgium is the country that gains Rwanda and Burundi, Rwanda's neighboring country to the south, and together at the time they were referred to as Rwanda Urundi. So Belgium takes over in 1922, and by then, Musinga and the White Fathers are fighting constantly. And so the White Fathers secure the downfall of Mwami Musinga, and they replace him with the more pliable Mwami Mutara. Don't worry about remembering all of these names. I know there's a lot of names that I'm throwing at you. What the point really illustrates is that by then, the Catholic priests, the White Fathers, were so powerful that they were able to dethrone a king, a sitting Mwami, and put in someone that they felt would be more pliable, one who had readily converted to Catholicism, and they saw as an ally. That's how powerful they had become. Now, before I start speaking about Belgian rule over Rwanda, which I'm going to, spoiler alert, was terribly destructive, I want to briefly address another legacy of first German, but also Belgian colonialism, and that is racism. Systemic racism, institutionalized racism, and the Hamitic myth. These colonizers introduced the pseudoscience of race and theories of culture-coded racism into Rwandan society, and this has a ripple effect all the way through to 1994 and beyond. So here's just a little bit of background. During the 19th and the 20th centuries, Europeans had developed stereotypes about the alleged stupidity, simplicity, and inherent threat of Black people. White European treatment of non-whites was characterized by race-based discrimination and this assumption of white superiority. And this race-based hierarchy promoted the subjugation and mistreatment of Blacks by their white oppressors. European racist notions at the time prompted them to equate the African continent as a whole, this large, beautiful, diverse space, with uncivilized societies and savagery that required civilizing and control. The problem was that kingdoms such as Rwanda challenged European myths about Black Africa. Rwanda was a highly developed society. It had established boundaries, a complex hierarchy, elaborate rituals. To explain how that could be, Europeans seized upon and propagated the Hamitic theory. Basically, they claimed that the Tutsi ruling class in Rwanda must be the lost sons of Ham. Who is Ham? He is from the biblical story of Noah, and he was Noah's son, the one who was banished for laughing at his father's nakedness. And this myth enabled Europeans to cling to their imperialist racism. It ended up being used by colonizers around the continent to explain any sign of development throughout Africa. And in Rwanda, it also contributed to the Tutsis becoming a racialized minority. The colonial application of the Hamitic myth signals this moment where the link between race and color was ruptured in Rwanda. And from then on, Tutsi starts to become a racial category and not just an ethnicity. This is a theory that has been explored in great detail by a scholar named Mahmoud Madani, and he writes really brilliantly about this. Now, the German colonialists deployed the Tutsi minority as a ruling class over the majority Hutu. They thought they had found their lost European brothers, and they elevated them in status as such. This was also a very effective weapon for colonial rule, divide and conquer, indirect rule through a select minority class, giving them some favors, but still keeping them under the heel of the colonizers. They also took a rather direct approach in some instances, meddling directly in state affairs, particularly against the Mwami and the Mwami's consolidated and before them indisputed power. Germany controlled Rwanda using this very highly effective hybrid approach of indirect rule through the Tutsis, divide and conquer policy, and then asserting themselves through the royal court and its network of loyal chiefs and sub-chiefs. Education was also, interestingly, a way that they were able to exacerbate the division between Hutu and Tutsi. And education sat with the white fathers. They opened the first school in Rwanda in 1905, and they formalized an instruction policy in which Tutsis were taught in French, a European language, and Hutus were taught in Swahili, a local Bantu language. This further exacerbated divisions, and you start seeing some explanation for why there were multiple rebellions during this period, predominantly Hutu-led, and they would target the monarchy rather than the colonialists, which is such an interesting, it's an interesting sidebar, because here they weren't going after the real source of tension and disruption in their lives. They were buying into this anti-Tutsi ideology that had been introduced through the indirect rule of the colonial powers. So Belgium takes control of Rwanda after the defeat of Germany in World War I, and they collapse. They had 3 colonies at this point. They collapse them into one conglomerate: Congo, Belge, Rwanda, Urundi. So it's the Congo, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Rwanda, and Burundi. They collapse them all together in 1925. And this is a massive swath of land that contains many different groups and languages and kingdoms and people. They did a horrific job. They were horrible colonizers. They were very destructive. And they institutionalized that German constructed distinction between Hutu and Tutsi in Rwanda. Later on, they even went further and turned myth effectively into fact by developing colonial policies that were based upon the division between this distinction they had created between Hutu and Tutsi. So some examples. Belgian colonizers enacted colonial reform policies in the 1920s. They went about reducing the number of Hutu chiefs and sub-chiefs and concentrated power into the hands of a few select Tutsi chiefs who were able to rule with relative autonomy and almost complete and absolute impunity, to be honest. While these measures were intended at the time to weaken the king in favor of the Tutsi chiefs and work towards his downfall, it also resulted in exacerbated Hutu-Tutsi divisions. This period of colonial rule also excluded women. There were women who had roles in the royal court and in the animist faith practices that existed in Rwanda. But instead, we see their marginalization, both in public and private spheres, further and further codified by the Belgians. And the Belgians squeezed Rwanda's Hutu population ruthlessly. They wanted to maintain a steady stream of goods that went into their hands, and so they sanctioned the use of force to impose mandatory unpaid Hutu labor, to collect goods and taxes. They were extremely violent, and their attitude was quite simple. They charged the Tutsi chiefs with collecting and organizing this steady flow of goods, and some of them complied quite willingly and happily, but others, they were told, you whip the Hutu or we will whip you. And so they were forced into this role of master for some. Others were more than happy to comply. I don't want to pretend it was one way or the other. There's complexity to this narrative. But then came the census, the national census of 1933 and 34, where Belgians sought to identify ethnicity on the basis of oral accounts, physical measurements. You can see photographs here of what that looked like, cattle herd size, etc. Once they were able to, in their minds, categorize the people according to Hutu or Tutsi, and for a very small minority, Twa, they codified it. And with that fluidity on this Hutu-Tutsi continuum, the ability to transition between Hutu and Tutsi, that disappears. Instead, ethnicity was established at birth. It passed on from father to child, thereby eliminating any role for women in whether or not the identity of their children, the ethnic identity. And it was put into identity cards and used throughout the country as a means for gaining favor and being treated according to a tiered class system. Then things changed. There was World War II that came. And for the Belgians, ironically, the tables were turned and suddenly they were the ones being occupied by a foreign power, even as they continued to occupy Rwanda. After World War II, the United Nations was created, and there was this push for self-rule throughout the colonized states within Africa. And you start to see independent movements that sweep the continent. And during the 1950s, this wave of independence movements is vibrant and happening also in Rwanda. And you see the Tutsi elite followed quickly by the Hutu elite beginning to call for Rwanda's independence. Now, the role of German and Belgian colonizers in the construction and manipulation of ethnic identity ends up being central to this pre and immediate post-independence period. And this period sees a lot of ethnic fracture and violence. Colonialism effectively split the Hutus and the Tutsis into separate consciousnesses and opposed ethnic groups. In this way, unfortunately, Rwanda followed a unique path to statehood, and unfortunately, the Hutu and the Tutsi were not able to unify in their efforts. Some tried, and some did, but they were effectively overwhelmed by those that sought to instead focus on what divided them. So for example, when the United Nations decolonization mission arrived in Kigali in 1957 to do an assessment, it received two contrasting documents. One was drafted by the Mwami's court and called for a transfer of power from Belgians back to the Mwami. They wanted to reinstitute the monarchy and bring the Mwami back into power and establish a kingdom of Rwanda. They received a second document, and this one was drafted by 9 Hutu male intellectuals that denounced Tutsi domination, called for popular rule, and drew upon the Hamitic myth that had been popularized by the colonial powers. And this document, by the way, is famously known as the Hutu Manifesto. A series of ethnic-based atrocities committed by Hutus and Tutsis followed throughout the 1950s, and this decade saw political turmoil, growing ethnic tensions. The Belgians and the Catholic Church continued to maneuver and manipulate in this bid for power, and rather than engage both parties and try to develop a unified approach for a peaceful transition of power, you see the Belgians and the Catholic Church set one group against the other, exacerbating these ethnic divisions, drafting documents, helping to widen the gap that existed between them even further. And so despite a shared language, a shared history, a shared culture, a shared religion, shared traditions, nationalism did not trump ethnic divisionism in Rwanda. Instead, we see that nationalism incorporated ethnic-related colonial myths and stereotypes. And by the time of the 1959 revolution, these tensions exploded into acts of violence. Now, the 1959 revolution followed on the heels of the sudden death of Mwami Mutara and the formation of a number of political parties in Rwanda that were grounded in ethnic identity and which ended up strengthening the Hutu majority in Rwanda. This period was marked by cyclical violence against Tutsis, ethnic extremism, and the first instances that we see of large-scale perpetration of violence against Rwandans turning against Rwandans. This is the first instance of it in modern Rwandan history. I also want to note that we also start to see the first instances of rescue. So there are those moments of heroism and upstanderism that existed even in 1959 and the early 1960s. But this is really the first wave of mass violence that we see in modern Rwandan history. And unfortunately, that was a cycle that started to repeat itself from the 1959 all the way through to 1994. These years also saw the end of Tutsi minority rule and a reorganization of power that was shared by a nexus of Hutu elites, many of whom were from a clan in the north. Now, the Belgians they could have worked towards a peaceful transition of power. I firmly believe they could have. Instead, they provoked violence. They played the two sides off of one another to what I think they perceived as their own benefit at the time. And unfortunately, the Catholic Church ended up offering political, moral, and logistic assistance to the Hutu leaders, even as they were calling for and perpetrating violence against the Tutsi minority. And so the colonial masters of the time really failed Rwanda. And unfortunately, in the end, Belgian colonial influence did not result in a democratic Rwanda. On the contrary, up until 1994, the country was ruled by two dictators. The first one was Gregor Kayibanda, who is pictured here, standing with Belgian and Rwandan officials. And the second ruler was Juvenal Habyarimana. Kayibanda's newly formed Hutu government sought vengeance. They sought to punish and gain vengeance against the Tutsis. And so we see the first cycle of violence and instability in newly independent Rwanda start almost immediately in 1963. Some 20,000 Tutsis were murdered, and over 300,000 Tutsis were forced into exile in neighboring countries. Many of them ended up fleeing to Uganda, but some fled to Tanzania, some made their way to the Congo, Burundi, even as far as Kenya, and they lived abroad. This period of violence, not that there's a neat start and end to it, but we approximate it began around 1963, right after independence, and ended in 1967. And these violent measures were justified by the government as necessary. They saw that they were defensive measures against repeated incursions of Tutsi refugees living along the northern border, and in a bid to consolidate their power and ensure that the Tutsis were not able to overthrow them. Now, the Belgian initiated identity cards, which we talked about a little bit before, they ended up being used by the new government and were a tool that were used from 1962 onward in order to discriminate against the remaining Tutsi population. They would use those identity cards in order to identify Tutsis in the population and then deny them access to employment, education, opportunities, and positions of power and influence. Now, Juvenal Habyarimana, he was a general in the armed forces in Rwanda. He took power in a bloodless coup in 1973, so 11 years later, and he ruled the country until his assassination on April 6th, 1994. So he's in power for decades. And it was during this period that we see a group of intimates, mostly from the north, who are like Habyarimana and his wife, Agath, Madame Agath, and they formed something called the Akazu, or Little House. This was a network of individuals that enjoyed positions of power in business and in government, And Madame Agath operated in many ways as the gatekeeper for this consortium. In order to be admitted, most members relied upon some sort of familial connection to or a relationship with Madame Agath rather than her husband, who was in fact the president at the time. She was the one who really wielded the power and over this small network. The legend of Conjugera resonated among Rwandans, and many of them would actually go on to nickname Madame Agath Conjugera in light of the power that she wielded during this period from 1973 until 1994. And actually, she's still in exile in France, and she's still considered, she still wields considerable influence among some extremists living in exile who are against the current Rwandan government. Now, during Habyarimana's 21 years in power, Rwanda's Tutsi minority did suffer discrimination and marginalization, and there were occasional bouts of violence, but nothing nearly as severe as what had taken place in 63 to 67. But by 1994, these Hutu and Tutsi divisions had been internalized within the Rwandan psyche. They didn't even realize that they were a colonial import. And on the evening of April 6, 1994, a private jet carrying President Habyarimana began its descent into Kigali International Airport. And as the plane approached the airport, it was shot out of the sky by a ground-to-air missile. Two, actually. The first one missed, the second one hit it. And the plane crashed into the presidential compound, ironically, and killed all of the passengers on board. Immediately, these extremists sprang into action under the direction of several key elites, many of whom were members of the Akazu, that little house that was controlled, that inner circle that was controlled by Madame Agath. They set up roadblocks, they distributed lists of influential Rwandans who were marked for murder, and they conducted home raids. Rwanda's extremist Radio Télévision Libre de Mille Collines, it was a popular mouthpiece for the Hutu extremists. They quickly blamed Habyarimana's assassination on the Tutsis and launched a heated campaign to incite genocide around the country. Thus, the assassination of President Habyarimana ends up triggering a series of actions that were prearranged, in my opinion, strong opinion, by members of the Akazu and a secret cabal of conspirators. By the morning of April 7th, the genocide was well underway in the capital city of Kigali, and it soon spread throughout the country. And over the course of the next 100 days, over 900,000 Tutsis and Hutu moderates, we may never know how many people were actually murdered. There are some estimates that go well over 1 million. They were systematically hunted, tortured, raped, and murdered as part of an orchestrated genocide. Rwanda and both the country, I should note, and also the people, was completely devastated by this genocide. It's been labeled the fastest genocide in modern history, and the loss of life was also compounded by the flight of estimates of about 2 million additional people in just 3 months. People fleeing the violence and some people fleeing justice, the perpetrators. Up to 150,000 children were orphaned and vulnerable after the genocide. Approximately 250,000 to maybe upwards of 500,000 women survivors had been raped. Many had been deliberately infected with HIV/AIDS, and the country's infrastructure was completely devastated. Still, Rwanda went on to rebuild, and Rwanda continues to rebuild, not just as a country, but also as a people. And that has also included building its identity, rebuilding its identity, creating a new one. Post-genocide, Rwanda has worked to eliminate some of the codified ethnic-based discriminatory practices and build a new Rwandan identity. This can also be seen in the 2003 constitution that was adopted and other measures taken throughout the country. And I'm starting to see, as a personal anecdote, I'm starting to see some of the impact of these efforts in the next generation of Rwandan youth who are now taking the reins of leadership in Rwanda. And they give me great hope that hopefully the legacy of colonialism is further receding into Rwanda's past and will no longer dictate its present and its future. And I think I'll stop there. And I want to open up the chat so that I can see. Let's see, how do I get to the chat? I think I have to actually stop. Hold on 1 second. And if anyone has any questions that they want to ask me, I would be absolutely happy to answer them. It can be questions about, gosh, you know what? I'll throw it open. Whatever you want to ask. It could be questions about pre-colonial Rwanda, colonial Rwanda, post-colonial Rwanda, the genocide itself, post-genocide Rwanda, our center here, whatever it is that you'd like to ask, I'd be happy to hear from you. And thank you everyone for being here. That's a great question. So Linda asked, are there still remnants of colonization in colonialism in Rwanda despite efforts to develop a unified Rwanda? Unfortunately, yes. I mean, I think there are tremendous efforts to correct many of the devastating impacts of colonialism. But for sure, there is still a legacy that still exists in Rwanda and an influence. You can see it in the use of French as one of the predominant languages, although the government that took over after 1994, after the genocide, this unified power sharing government, they worked very hard to make Kinyarwanda the language of the government. They worked extremely hard to do that. But you see that French and English are still dominant languages throughout the country. They're used in instruction and education and also in political discourse. Although that has benefited the country in that they're able to participate in the broader international sphere. And so it's not always necessarily a negative one. There is definitely still the colonial legacy that exists in the form of, some people refer to it as like a neo-colonial influence. So you saw it first with the Belgians and later with the French. The French kind of usurped Belgium influence in Rwanda and became strong allies of Habyarimana in the 1970s and played a really big role in influencing the country and also in helping to even train the Interahamwe killing militias that went on to perpetrate the genocide in 94. So I didn't even touch upon all of the ways that these former colonial powers continued to assert their influence in Rwanda, often to the detriment of Rwanda, but not always. I don't want to say it's entirely negative. Interestingly, and this is just kind of a fun side note, Rwanda, in perhaps in a way of thumbing their nose at the French colonizers, joined the British Commonwealth. They officially petitioned and joined the British Commonwealth, even though they were never a British colony. And are very proud members of that. And English has certainly been the dominant language aside from Kinyarwanda. It has surpassed French as the influential language in the country. Okay, let's see. Oh my goodness. All right. How did other governments react to the genocide? Unfortunately, the majority of governments stood by and did nothing during the genocide. And the United Nations, even though they had a peacekeeping force in Rwanda at the time of the genocide, largely failed. A lot of rules and edicts dictated out of the New York headquarters of the United Nations effectively stripped the mission that was there of their power and their ability, their mandate to go out and effectively intervene and stop the genocide. Still, there were heroic efforts that were led by the commander of the forces, then Lieutenant General Romeo Dallaire. He's since gone on to adopt a number of other honorifics and titles. And he was able to rescue, but by and large, the international community failed Rwanda. The genocide in Rwanda ended because a rebel group of Tutsis out of Uganda were the ones that went through and effectively stopped the genocide. Took power and implemented a power-sharing national unity government in Rwanda. As far as we know, there are no known assassins in regards to who shot down the plane. Is that still true today? So the question of who shot down Habyarimana's plane is subject to great debate. I have read a number of the reports. There was one done by the Rwandans. There was one done by a Spanish judge. There was the Mutsinzi report. There was The British report, I tend to like the British report the best because they use these trajectory predictive models to figure out where the trajectory, based on the trajectory of the air to, because there were 2 missiles that were shot, they're able to figure out where they landed and estimate where they came from. And based on their estimates, it looks like the missiles came directly from the president's own personal bodyguards camp. Which would implicate the Hutu extremists in the assassination of Habyarimana. You will hear many deniers, though, pull all kinds of other reports that have been done, claiming that it was in fact the RPF rebels, the Tutsi-led rebels, who killed Habyarimana. We may never know with any absolute certainty. I'm more confident in the narrative that came from that British report than others, but I suggest if you want to do a real dive down the rabbit hole of these reports, there are many to look at, but the British one is quite good. At this time, is Rwanda an independent country? It is an independent country. It is a parliamentary system. There is a president and a prime minister and a Senate court, and then the elected lower parliament, as you would call it. I think I'm probably not using the right terminology, so I apologize. It's a democracy. It's a growing democracy, a developing democracy. I think we all know, especially those of us here in the United States, democracy is a process. And here it took us, well, it's only been a century now that women have had the right to vote. So it took us quite a while to get to the idea of the chance that all of us could enjoy the promise of freedom and liberty and pursuit of happiness. But they are growing and they're making great strides. I will note that Rwanda was the first country in the world, not the Scandinavian countries, nobody else. It was Rwanda in 2008 that elected a women's majority parliament. And they did that feat again in 2013. So perhaps we could learn a few things from them. Let's see. Are there specific examples of how a new identity is being developed in Rwanda beyond language? Yeah, there have been, they have eliminated the use of ethnic categories in political discourse, and they are very strict about language that could promote ethnic divisionism. So they, here in the United States, we enjoy just tremendous freedom of speech. It's quite unique, actually, that we have that here in the US. I would say Rwanda is a little bit closer and probably a little bit further along, a little bit more restrictive, much more restrictive, I should say, than like the German model, where there are certain things you're still not allowed to say about the Holocaust, for example. In Rwanda, it's the same, but also with the utilization of ethnic discourse and ethnic language and ethnic categories, the use of those terms in certain lexicon and certain turns of phrase, those are all punishable with even court sentences, because they are trying to push this unity and get rid of the prior ethnic divisionism that existed. They haven't fully succeeded, of course. They're making strides, but they also have done a great unification program called Indi Munyarwanda. They use social media very effectively, especially among the youth, to promote unity and a sense of shared pride in Rwanda's achievements, especially in how they have grown and developed since 1994. They're very much the startup nation of Central Africa, much like Israel is for the Middle East. Where do the estimates of murders come from? Boy, it's unfortunately, I don't know how to say this without, it's quite dark. They're still unearthing mass graves. And so the estimates of how many people actually died in Rwanda, first of all, we may never know, because they used many of the major waterways, the rivers and the Lake Kivu, as dumping grounds for bodies. It's very hard to estimate how many were thrown into rivers and forcibly drowned or thrown into Lake Kivu, but the numbers keep growing. I tend to lean on, there's a tremendous sociologist, criminologist named Holly Neiseth from The Ohio State University. And she estimates about 900,000. I use her numbers because I very much trust how she's gone about her methodology in finding those estimates. The Rwandan government says it's probably closer to 1.2 million. They may well be right. Again, we may never know. It's an unfortunate and gruesome task to try to locate all of the bodies still. What role did the refugees in Uganda play in the genocide? These questions are so good, by the way. I'm not even sure I'm going to be able to get to all of them, but any I don't get to, I promise I'll shoot you an email afterwards and try to answer it. What role did the refugees in Uganda play in the genocide? So this is something that I didn't really talk about in my history. I skimmed over it. But actually, there was a band of Tutsi-led rebels called the RPF, the Rwandan Patriotic Front. And in 1990, they invaded Rwanda from the north in Uganda. They came down and they made very quick advancements. They almost made it to Kigali, the capital city. And it greatly alarmed Juvenal Habyarimana, then the president. And he called in the French. And the French helped to fight back the RPF rebels. And then there was this détente between the two and negotiations that ensued. And something that was called the Arusha Accords was agreed upon, named so for the town in which they had negotiated the peace deal, the peace agreement, Arusha, Tanzania. And it is from Arusha that President Habyarimana's flight originated. He was flying back from one of the Accords meetings. And it is believed that the extremists may have assassinated him because he had conceded too much power and given in too many things given in too much to the demands of the Tutsi rebels. They wanted a right to return home. They wanted a role in the government and a return to multi-party democracy. Rwanda by that point was a single party state. It was in a dictatorship completely. And they wanted an end to discrimination against Tutsis, and those in the Hutu elite who were controlling the country were adamantly opposed to these concessions. And so it is believed that Habyarimana may have been massacred in a bid to get him out of the way, and it also served as a convenient catalyst for the genocide. That's one theory. That's the theory I largely subscribe to. What do you think of how the era of colonialism still rears its message of inferior versus superior in the modern day world, not just in Africa? Unfortunately, institutionalized racism, systemic racism around the world owes its roots to those 18th and 19th century developments where there were those wrapped up in this pseudoscience of trying to figure out racial categories and racial superiority. You've got, the likes of French philosopher Arthur de Gobineau and his role in perpetuating even anti-Semitism. They all go hand in hand, unfortunately, and we are going to continue to be dismantling them. And I think we can be quite constructive in how we do so, identifying it, seeing it for what it is, working to be the change that we want to see. But unfortunately, yes, it still rears its head in Central Africa and beyond, in all of the former colonial states, and even here in the United States. How has the role of women in the government changed? Of course, my mom asked this question. Thank you, Mom. I appreciate that. That softball speaks directly to my PhD dissertation and to the book that I published on this, which is about gender and the genocide in Rwanda. But in the post-genocide aftermath, it's really the women who take the lead in the country. A number of women had leadership positions in the Rwandan Patriotic Front, that Tutsi-led rebel group. And interestingly, in the post-genocide aftermath, genocide tears at the social fabric that keeps a community together. Interestingly, within those tears are spaces for women to exercise agency in a way that they weren't able to in pre-genocide Rwanda. Pre-genocide Rwanda, a woman couldn't even open a bank account without the signature of a man. She couldn't legally inherit property. Women made up less than 5% of the elected officials in the government. And so they weren't really in a place to advocate for change. And so it was quite revolutionary that in the post-genocide aftermath, women weren't pushed back into those spaces and they weren't, again, marginalized. Instead, many women went on to take leadership positions. The first mayor of Kigali was a lieutenant from the RPF who was in the army, Rose Kabuye. She became the first mayor. You see a number of women work to dismantle the 1992 family law that codified this idea that men were the legal heads of the household. You see women, Hutu and Tutsi women alike, unite to address the issue of the upwards of 150,000 orphans who remained after the genocide. They started an adoption program, bringing those children into homes and closing the orphanages that had popped up around the country. And so the women took all of these great leadership initiatives and ended up, in the end, affecting really great positive change throughout the country. Post-genocide reconciliation efforts. Goodness, there have been so many. The first thing really was a justice initiative, trying to get justice for the victims and survivors of the genocide. I think that was a really important and necessary step for the country to be able to move on. You saw at first that Rwanda requested that the United Nations put together the ad hoc criminal tribunal that was in Arusha, Tanzania, actually. They weren't happy with how that was rolling out in the slow progress of the courts. And so in the end, they created a hybrid system in Rwanda that tried, I think according to the 2012 report, 1,003,227 individuals for over 1.9 million suspected acts of genocide. That justice initiative was huge. It was flawed. All justice initiatives are, to be perfectly honest. But it was flawed, and I don't think that it covered everything, but that was a key step. You also see steps taken by the government to implement, to dismantle the ethnic stratification and divisionism, to promote unity. They instituted something called Umuganda, where on one Saturday every month, everyone goes out into the community and they do public works projects together. All of the shops shut down and everybody works on something, and then they all come together as a community after they do the volunteer work, and they talk about projects that they want for their community, issues they're having in the community, things that they'd like to see for the community. And it's this really great space that's constructed. It's a semi-structured space into which people can come together, talk, work out their issues, and also work towards a common good. There have also been rehabilitation and re-education camps, which have been extremely controversial. Those are referred to as Ingando. And there have been a number of initiatives, but those cover a few of them. How did refugees fare in Europe or other neighboring countries? Okay, I think I understand that question. You mean people that fled from Rwanda after the genocide and went on to build new lives, is what my assumption is. It's a mixed bag. I think a lot of people, look, very rarely do you see refugees who say, yeah, I left my country because I wanted to, and this is such a great and fun new start. People are forced from their homes. They flee for their lives. And so coming to the United States or countries in Europe or Australia or elsewhere, South Africa, and starting a new life is often very hard. And they carry with them the emotional and psychological baggage and trauma of what they experienced in 1994 during the genocide. And then they also have to face the struggles of a new immigrant coming to the United States and learning a new language and a new culture, facing discrimination, possibly facing rejection, rebuilding. I would say on the whole, the Rwandan community here in the United States, with whom I've had quite a bit of contact, has done remarkably well. And they are quite effective in forming their own advocacy networks, making sure that there are national commemorations held throughout the United States to remember what happened in 1994, and to come together and support one another. They've put together survivor networks and support groups. They do quite a bit. It's not always the case for other refugee groups, and so they've been quite the model. Let's see. Why do I think that the West remained silent or passive while thousands of Tutsis were being wiped out? Unfortunately, in 1994, Rwanda's primary exports were coffee and tea. They weren't exactly politically strategic. They weren't a linchpin upon which the region, operated. I think that when countries like the United States did an assessment of whether or not to get involved, it did not make sense according to their very flawed calculations to expend any effort. In fact, they worked very hard to make sure that the UN did not get involved and did these linguistic gymnastics to avoid using the G word, genocide, because they were so afraid if they called it a genocide, they would be force under the 1948 Genocide Convention, the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, to take action. So unfortunately, it was a flawed calculation, because since then I could make a pretty effective argument just on the dollars and cents side that it's much cheaper to get involved before the absolute devastation and help a country meaningfully transition and intervene rather than rebuild after it's been completely devastated. Yes, the US and world media did cover what was happening in Rwanda at the time. And there is a tremendous, if you ever want to read about some of the great efforts that were undertaken, read anything by Linda Melvern. She was very interesting, in this journalist that just happened to know everything that was going on. But it was well known, so much so that the 1994, I think it was the cover of the May Time magazine, says there are no devils left in hell. They've all gone to Rwanda. People knew what was going on. Will I please give you my resources? Happily, I'm going to send out a list of resources that I've curated with the assistance of Ali Evans, and we will send it out also with a recorded version of this talk later today or tomorrow, depending on how quickly we get the video edited. You mentioned rescue throughout the violence. Where can we find these stories, or can you share some of them? That's a great question, Maggie. I love it. There were many instances of rescue, heroic rescue, people who at great risk to themselves and their family, and with full knowledge that it was at great risk to themselves and their family, still decided to take meaningful action to save those who were intended targets of the genocidaires, the perpetrators. There are a number of accounts, not to plug my book, but to plug my book, I guess. There are a number of accounts in my book which addresses rescue, and that is available as a free download. It is now an open resource text. I collaborated with a group called Knowledge Unlatched, and it is now free to download. If you go on Amazon or any other site, you'll be able to do that. I'll share one story. It's the story of Sula Karuhimbi. And Sula Karuhimbi was an elderly woman by the time the genocide began. It's not really known her age. When they interviewed her about 10 years ago, she was already in her, maybe more than 10 years ago, gosh. She was probably in her 90s. So she's an older woman. And she was fierce, absolutely fierce. And she estimates that she was able to save dozens of people, maybe as many as 60 or more people in her small compound, because she was known throughout the area as someone who had a relationship with the female spirit deity, Nyabingi. Basically, in like our modern parlance, this doesn't cover it, but she was like a witch, but she wasn't. But that's the closest I can come. She was like she had a spiritual force to her. And she was greatly revered in her community, and she was known for this. And so when the Interahamwe killing militias came to her compound and said, hand over to us everyone that you have in your compound, we know you're hiding Tutsis, she would invoke the Nyabingi and threaten them and say, I will set fire to you, I will set boils to you, you will die a most painful death if you even cross over this boundary into my compound. And they were terrified of her. She was quite small. You can see she's tiny when they interviewed her, she's this tiny, diminutive, tiny little woman, but fierce and fearless. And she would come out rattling these gourds that had items inside of them and invoking spirits. And she'd fall down and start calling to the spirit, and they would be terrified and they'd run away. Then they set up a roadblock right outside of their house. They said, okay, well, we're going to catch people on their way in. People are fleeing to your home. We're going to catch them on the way in. She goes there in the middle of the night. She sets fire to the thing. And they're terrified. They don't want to do anything. They're so afraid of her. She had several young girls who were with her. And they knew she had the young girls with her, and they wanted to take these girls from her. She would tie them to her kitenge, to her cloth. And she would hold them so tight to her that there was no way that they could seize these girls, because they would have to touch her. And God forbid they do that, because God knows what would happen to them. Now, the story goes that when the RPF rebels came along and they liberated her area, they didn't know who she was. And they asked her, who are you? And she goes, who are you? Because this is the lady who, she doesn't spare any fools. And they said, well, we're the Inkutani, which was a slang term to talk about the rebels. And she goes, there's nobody more Inkutani than me, and just walks away from them. So the story of Sula is one example of just how fearless women undertook just tremendous risks in order to protect those around them. Sometimes people they didn't even know. And thank God for them, because they really did a great service to their community and their country. And they're role models whom we should emulate. And I think on that positive note, I'm going to thank everyone for attending. I see there are so many additional questions. Don't worry, I have them all recorded right here, and I will make sure to answer them. Oh my gosh, there's like a dozen more questions. I'll get to them, I promise. But thank you so much, everyone, for being here, for sharing your Wednesday afternoon with us. Have a wonderful day. Take care, stay well, and see you soon. Hopefully very soon in person, but next time probably on Zoom. Bye, everyone.